Hi, good morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching this. I hope you've had a good week. It's been a beautiful week around here in Deer Park, and some of you are scattered around different parts of the country still, and that's okay. I hope your part of the country is as nice as it's been here in Texas on the Gulf Coast for a while. Before I start our lesson, I want to give a little testimony to something that happened to me this week that was kind of interesting. I was having coffee at a local coffee shop that I visit quite often, and I was sitting there drinking my coffee and eating my little pastry thing, and I noticed in the corner this young woman sitting by herself. She'd been there, she was there when I came in, and I'd been there for a little while, and she seemed a little sad, a little puzzled. There was kind of a mixture of emotions going through her face, and I thought, this looks like someone who needs a happy face or a how are you today kind of deal, something to cheer up. So I went over, I introduced myself. She was quite a bit younger than I was. I assured her I was not there to hit on her or anything, but introduced myself, said I have coffee here quite often, and I thought I knew most of the regulars, but I'd not seen her here before. And I noticed that she was kind of sad, kind of lonely. I just wondered if there was anything I could do for her, anything I could help her with, any advice or whatever. And she said no, she was just working through a family problem she'd been trying to figure out. She said she was trying to figure out why she has 3 sisters and her brother has 4. So I left her alone. Well, that's kind of how my day goes sometimes. We're in the book of Ezra today. We'll get into that book in just a moment. Before we open that book, if you've not already turned there, if you can hang on just a second, let me start us with a word of prayer, please. God, we thank you, we love you, we come together in your name, even though we're spread out. We know that you are our focus. We know that the Spirit of God binds us and brings us together in unity. We'd ask you, God, to open our ears, open our minds, open our hearts today, that the things we read from the book of Ezra will be meaningful to us, will say something to our hearts, something that each of us need to hear. I know you've spoken to my heart this week as I prepared this lesson. Guard us and guide us as we go through this. Be with us, that this day we worship you in all your glory, and we have a extreme sensitivity to your presence in our life. We thank you and we ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, be turning to Ezra. We're going to be reading first of all from the 4th chapter. I titled this lesson 40 Miles of Bad Road. I was listening to radio the other day, one of the oldies station, and a song came on from, I can't remember if it's the late 50s or early 60s. It's a guitar song by Dwayne Eddy. I don't know if he was the originator of it or if it's a remake, a cover of somebody else's, but the title of it is 40 Miles of Bad Road. And I thought that fits. So that became the title of this lesson. Well, I'd like to ask you, who likes driving where the roads are under construction or under improvement, and there's detours and stoppages, roadblocks, big burly barrel guys everywhere for miles and miles? Well, in life it seems we're constantly facing challenges. And like cross-country driving, we can have a long period of ease and good weather, great scenery, and then suddenly with no warning comes 40 miles of bad road. I know when I travel to Tennessee or to Virginia to see my brother-in-law or my kids, I'm going along, and that's a long distance. It's 900 miles to Tennessee. It's 1,300 miles to Virginia. And somewhere along there is going to be some construction, always. Well, one of the most disheartening and depressing situations occurs in our lives when we're working diligently for God, doing what we know He called us to do, heading in the right direction with all kinds of good things going our way, and then suddenly, like that cross-country drive, we run into 40 miles of bad road. What once seemed like a situation where everything we did was directed by God and blessed by God now seems to be falling completely apart. And we give up. Or at least we want to. Well, as I say, we're beginning a study in Ezra. We're going to do 2 lessons, one today and one next week out of Ezra. Excuse me, my little cough and my allergies. It's that little 10-chapter book between 2nd Chronicles and Nehemiah. I mentioned in last week's lesson from Haggai, kind of just in passing, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And after I finished that lesson, I thought to myself, Self, it's been a while since you did anything from Ezra. And so, here we are. A little bit of information about the book. Excuse me, let me get a drink of water. I apologize. Thought I had this under control. But apparently not. The author of the book of Ezra is Ezra. There's no serious challenge from any theologians or scholars to that fact. But as an aside, there's a ton of evidence that suggests that the author of Ezra also penned 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Nehemiah, even though the book of Nehemiah is named Nehemiah. It's about Nehemiah. All these books, these 4 books, they're all about lists and temple artifacts and things in the temple, and they all use similar wording. Oh, I apologize. Simple wording and phrases that are used that would be kind of unique maybe to a particular author rather than several authors. And each one is sort of a journal, an Old Testament blog, if you will, of the memoirs of the author. Also, Ezra is a contemporary of Haggai and Zechariah, as we've mentioned in prior lessons. The date of the book, it was penned around 440 BC, and it deals with events spanning 538 BC until about 450 BC. The historical setting, it is now 70 years, the 70 years of Babylonian exile are over. We talked about this from our lesson from Haggai. 70 years of Babylonian exile are over. The Israelites are returning to Israel under the decree of Cyrus, who defeated Babylon in 539 BC, and he subsequently released the Jews from their bondage. And we talked last week about he was going to release the Jews to go back to Judah, and he was going to do so in 3 groups of people over a period of time. It's a similar time frame to Haggai's prophecy. Well, there are 49,897 Jews who have returned to Israel in this first wave under the leadership of Zerubbabel, spanning about 100 years of 3 returns over a period of time. Their purpose was to rebuild the temple and reinitiate the Mosaic sacrificial system. Well, with that little bit of introduction, let's turn to Ezra. And as I say, we're going to start with the 4th chapter. We're going to read the first 5 verses. Ezra 4, 1 through 5. Now when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of the family of Israel answered and said, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They hired counselors to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and on down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Okay, here's the scene. We've got nearly 50,000 Jews. They're coming back home, most of them settling around the Jerusalem area. It's a desolated land that's been pretty much ignored for the last 70 years while they were in exile. And the first thing they want to do is make it home again. And that means the first thing to do is rebuild the temple. They get a good plan going. They're heading in the right direction. They're having a good time doing what they believe God has told them to do. And suddenly, there's that 40 miles of bad road. What was their first roadblock to their temple project? Well, their enemies wanted to help them with the building project. Yeah, right. The writer mentions that they responded that they didn't want or need help. They were building the temple for Jehovah God under the command of Cyrus of Babylon. And when the Jews left Babylon, Cyrus issued an edict that they were to return home and rebuild the temple. Not because he was a follower of Jehovah God. It was merely a political thing. Gods in this time were thought to be local and native to a specific geographic area. So the local gods protected their geographical area. Babylon was surrounded by all these little buffer countries, and they thought if they could keep the local gods of the buffer countries happy, that helped protect Babylon. So, what did the enemies of Judah and Benjamin, just a phrase meaning the Jews, what did they do next to thwart the building project? Well, it says, both in the King James and the NIV, that they hired people, counselors, to harass the workers, discourage them, and make them afraid to come to work. How often or how easy is it for you to become discouraged when you're trying to do something for God? How many of us started 2020 with a goal of reading our Bibles through this year? Who's still on that schedule? Raise your hand. Don't. Anyone make a resolution to begin or improve their quiet time this year? How's that working out for you? With a pandemic, we've all had plenty of time to do these things. If you're like me, we get easily sidetracked by the world. We allow obstacles to get in our way, discourage us, to get us angry, to frighten us, and we often give up completely. Well, that's exactly what the Jews did when these counselors came in, got them all riled up. They gave up. Well, let's skip down a little bit. Go down to that last verse of chapter 24, and then we're going to read the first 5 verses of chapter 5. Verse 24 of chapter 4. Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the prophet, a descendant of Edo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, helping them. At that same time, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, and their associates, went to them and asked, "Who authorized you to rebuild this temple and restore this structure?" And they also said, "What are the names of the men constructing this building?" But the eye of their God, Jehovah, was watching over the elders of the Jews, and they were not stopped until a report could go to Darius and his written reply be received. And there it is, verse 24. They stopped working because of the harassment of the counselors. And they stopped for 18 years. Now, chapter 5 is 18 years later after that verse 24. We read verse 24 and it says, "Thus the work of the house came to a standstill." And then verse 5, chapter 1, verse 5 begins 18 years later. The other two prophets who have their own books, Haggai and Zechariah, write about they're picking up the subject, the project, and leading the people to renew their goal of rebuilding the temple. They get the people all excited about it, and the work begins again 18 years later. And everything is looking good again. Things are on track. Haggai and Zechariah got them whipped into shape and moving them on. But in the meantime, back in Babylon, Cyrus has been replaced by a new king, Darius. And what happens again? Another 40 miles of bad road. The enemies of Judah come to Haggai and Zechariah again, this time led by the local governor of the region, one of Darius's flunkies named Tattenai. I'm probably butchering these names, but you do better, okay? Well, Tattenai comes to him, and he has a question for Haggai and Zechariah. He says, "Who authorized this work? And we want the names of all your workers. And we're going to report you to Darius. Then you'll be sorry you ever started this mess." I just woke my dog up. I'm sorry. Sorry, Gracie. Now, from these verses, how do you think Haggai and Zechariah responded? They didn't back down this time. They ignored Tattenai, and they sent him back packing. You know, when we're faced with challenges from sources that have no control over us, we often give up, or at least back off a bit. But if we're doing what we know to be God's will or direction for our life, then we need to stand tall and continue on. Well, let's pick up in chapter 6, verses 6 through 10 to begin with, and then we're going to skip down and do verses 13 through 16. So that's chapter 6, 6 through 10, 13 through 16. Now then, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai, and you and their fellow officials of that province, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let the governor of the Jews and the Jewish elders rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, I hereby decree what you are to do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this house of God. The expenses of these men are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury, from the revenues of Trans-Euphrates, so that the work will not stop. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and oil, as requested by the priests in Jerusalem, must be given them daily without fail, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. And then dropping down to 13. Then, because of the decree King Darius had sent, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Then the people of Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. So here's what happened between where we dropped off in the 5th chapter to the 6th. The Jews told Tattenai, we're going to keep on building this until we get a report from Darius to stop. We're under the okay to do this. So Tattenai goes to Darius to tattle on what the Jews are doing. They're building a temple and they didn't ask me for permission. Wow, you whiner. And I love what Darius said, and that's what we pick up in that 6th chapter. Darius replied, he says, not only do I agree with and fully authorize the building project, Tattenai, I'm giving you 3 instructions. First of all, leave them alone. Don't harass them. Do not annoy them. Do not interfere with them. Second, I am underwriting the costs directly and indirectly related to the project. You, Tattenai, as governor of the Trans-Euphrates area, you will make sure that it's your treasury that pays for the project. Third, you are to supply all the animals, the oils, the wines, whatever the priests ask for that they need to implement their sacrificial system to keep their God happy. You got it? What does this say about God's providing for our every need when we're in His will? It tells me that He will provide. In verses 13 and 16, we read that the project is completed. This was about 515 BC, 21 years after its initial rebuilding was started, and only 4.5 years after the second start. There was a huge dedication ceremony. Now, it wasn't as huge as when Solomon dedicated, but it was still quite a party. There were sacrifices, the priests were installed again, and the Mosaic sacrificial system was underway again. Now, here's a summary, recap of where we've been. When we're trying to do God's will, and we've got a clear direction from Him for some area of our life, we need to press onward regardless of challenges that we face. The Israelites could have been in the temple 16 years earlier had they just persevered over their enemy's harassment. Second of all, when we're trying to do God's will and we're on course with His direction for our life, He'll provide for our every need if we stay true and faithful to Him. Just as Darius paid for the construction and then provided all the initial elements for the sacrificial system to begin again, God will provide us with the tools and the resources we need to get the job done that He's called us to do. And it's usually above and beyond what we really need. What's that saying? Where God guides, God provides. How true. Third, Haggai and Zechariah had a vision from God, and they believed that through their confidence in God, their work would be blessed. Are you working for God with a confidence in God? Like driving along I-45 south, or even north, or I-10 west, our lives are going to occasionally encounter 40 miles of bad road. How we react, the attitude we have, can make all the difference in whether we come out on the other side frustrated or in victory. Well, thank you for your attendance today. I trust God gave you a message from this lesson that you needed to hear, and I hope you were listening to His Spirit as He spoke to you. I want you to have a wonderful week. Enjoy our Texas fall. Remember our prayer list. It hasn't grown too much, but a lot of the requests are still there and there's still needs. Update Vic as you need to with your praises and your requests. Let's keep the praises going. That's always good to hear. Keep an eye out for details of the official in-person return to our connection group in a few weeks. I don't know if you did. I streamed Sunday, I think. I'll maybe do that another week or two. I'm not sure when I'll return back in person, but I streamed Sunday the early service, which is my usual service, and then I hung around and came back for the contemporary service at 11. I've got to tell you, that's not my kind of service. I could fit in, but it's not what I'm used to. And that's okay. God's going to use it and has used it already to make a significant change. But keep an eye out for the official rules and regulations on the in-person return to our connection group in a few weeks. And as always, remember who you are and whose you are. Have a great week.